Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Hack Summit. We're joined here by Kent Beck, who's the inventor of extreme programming and modern test-driven development methodologies. He's written nine books on software development, and is one of the original signers of the Agile Manifesto back in 2001, and is also one of the initial driving forces behind the use of design patterns in object-oriented programming. And he's currently doing engineering at Facebook. Kent, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Ed. Thanks for organizing this again. I was happy to participate last year, and it's amazing to see what you've put together since then.
Great. So we're just going to do a fireside chat here. And audience, you feel free to jump in with questions and upvote each other's questions, and we'll take questions off the list as we go.
And so fireside chat means I have no idea what's going to happen next.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is completely unrehearsed. Kent and I have not scripted this at all. He has no idea what I'm going to ask him and what the audience is going to ask him, but there should be a great learning experience for everyone.
Bring it, Ed.
So Kent, maybe you can help kind of tell us a little bit more about, let's start off with where do you live right now in the country, and why have you chosen that venue?
I live in rural Southern Oregon, not Portlandia, the other end of the state, which is generally quite conservative. It was the western headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan back in the day. But on the flip side, we have peace and quiet. I have friends who know a lot about nature and don't know anything about computers, which is refreshing. And why did we pick it? It's an experiment in personal responsibility. Early on in my marriage with my partner Cynthia, we realized that society is set up to have other people be responsible for large parts of your life, at least to pretend to, whether it's healthcare or education or food or your career. There's this illusion that somebody else is going to take care of you, but it is an illusion. And so we decided that we would live our lives as an experiment in responsibility. So we homeschooled all 5 of our kids, the last of whom is about to head off to college. We raise food, not enough to live on. I mean, if I had to make my living as a farmer, I'd be in deep, deep trouble. But we do raise our own food. We have goats for milk and chickens for eggs, ducks for meat. We raise pigs for meat. My commute is 200 meters walk through the woods yelling at squirrels to get out of my way.
Wow, that's amazing. And so how do you juggle, because you have many responsibilities, I'm sure, at Facebook and with the various initiatives that you started over the years. How do you juggle all that with homeschooling children? That seems like it's a challenge.
Well, honestly, my partner took the bulk of responsibility for education, organizing things, and I'd step in where, if it was a topic that I really cared about, history or math, I'd step in. But for the most part, actually, my kids drove their own educations. They're all curious people. They're all going for what they really care about. And that's all I really care about, is that I wanted my kids to be passionate about what they were doing, and if they had a dream, they'd be going for it.
That's great. So tell me a little bit more about what you're working on these days at Facebook. What are your responsibilities day to day there? Sure.
It's my day job, my 80% is one-on-one coaching. When I was coming up, I had the good fortune to show up at Tektronix Labs, and Ward Cunningham was there. And he took me under his wing. If by took me under his wing you mean beat the crap out of me. And I learned so much from that interaction. When I got to Facebook and I could see, first I was the worst C++ programmer at Facebook, because there are people who are really good at programming, but something that was missing from the culture was that sense of mentorship in any kind of formal way. So I started mentoring people, and now there are, in the last 6 months, we probably had 30 senior engineers mentoring, in a formal sense, mentoring younger engineers. So that's a coaching program. And then out of that spins out a series of classes for engineers at various levels. So if I notice, this is how I always do my writing, if I explain something too many times and I get bored, then I find some way of scaling it. So we have classes for people straight out of school about time management, because that's the stuff that I explained to people straight out of school over and over again. Time management, setting priorities, keeping your eye on bigger goals. So we have a series of those classes that go all the way from people straight out of school to the most advanced engineers. My overall goal is that Facebook will come to be seen as a place you go to learn to be a great engineer. It's always been a place where you can do great engineering not in a very meticulous kind of watchmaker sense, but you can solve big problems. You can take and mitigate large risks for huge payoff. But it's you kind of get thrown in the deep end as a young engineer. So that's my goal, is to change that reputation to someplace where, yeah, you'll get thrown into the deep end, but we'll give you floaties.
And when you collaborate with engineers at Facebook and you're coaching them, do you do that remotely in a virtual manner, or are you actually on site at Facebook headquarters doing that?
Mostly it's done remotely. I just got back from a trip to Menlo Park, but yeah, 95% of my time is spent remote pair programming. Hey, Ed, there's the upside of running the conference from your house. You get these little moments of reality. Is there an update?
There's just a little technical issue we're working through here. 1 second.
Okay.
Whose camera? Okay. All right, there's just a camera issue we're working through here. Just give us 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, hopefully that'll be better. We'll keep going here, but everything is fine. Okay. So, okay, let's dive in. Sorry, go ahead.
So that's my day job. But I think every engineer has a responsibility to also do exploration, as well as kind of things that you're sure will pay off. You should be doing some things that you're not sure will pay off. So I also do quantitative research in software engineering. So I noticed that my students were listing many reviewers on their pull requests, just in case. And I thought, well, what's the optimal number of reviewers if you want a pull request to be responded to quickly? So that's a question can be answered with data. I went and pulled the data, looked at the distribution of pull request latencies, and it turns out the optimal number of reviewers to list is 1. And so that was like, oh, I wouldn't have expected that. But I do that kind of research where somebody will pose a question, or I'll pose myself a question that in days past I would have just answered with an opinion, you know, because after all, I'm the guru, blah, blah, blah. And I'll say, well, what does the data say? So I'll go look at the data, say, okay, well, yeah, how many reviewers should you have? It's not actually a matter of opinion. There's data that supports it. So I do that kind of stuff. And I'm working on a book called How Facebook Works, about our unusual engineering practices. So I scatter my time around a little bit. I have one main focus, and then I have a couple of other smaller things that I do on a regular basis.
So are there a few kind of best practices that you're personally passionate about that's used internally within Facebook that engineers might be able to learn from who are not currently working at Facebook?
Good question, and that's kind of why I'm writing the book. But the simple answer is that it's all so context dependent that focusing on the practices. I don't know. Do you have a dog yet?
I do, actually.
So if you try and point at something for your dog, my experience is the dog looks at your finger. Right? You're like, there's a rabbit over there. and the dog is just going to look at your finger, and no matter how hard you point, the dog's just staring at your finger. I think this focus on best practices that's the finger. You're actually pointing at something else. So if I said, well, here's how we set goals and track goals at Facebook, it wouldn't tell you anything really. That's the finger. What I'm pointing at is this sense of shared but personal responsibility. There's the saying at Facebook is nothing at Facebook is somebody else's problem. That's the real point. How you get there is going to be very different in different organizations. So if I said, oh, well, here's how we do P50 goals, you might want to copy that, but just copy, that's the finger. That's not what I'm trying to get at. The message that I have for people is it's both terrifying and satisfying to own all of an enormous service. But it works really well as long as everybody does that.
Okay, great. So let's go ahead and go to the audience questions. There's been a few questions that have been asked as we've been speaking. So the question with the top votes so far, with 113 votes, is what do you think about the web JavaScript development, test frameworks, and practice? There's so many good books and practices for back-end Java development, but they are not good enough applied to the web for an asynchronous model. Eventually, most JavaScript projects are becoming a mess. So I guess it's kind of alluding to, are there any best practices that you might recommend for developers who may be developing in an asynchronous fashion? How do design patterns, for example, apply to them?
Okay. So I'm not doing that day to day. So I have to rely on principles instead of personal experience. I want to make that distinction clear. So I might be completely wrong about this. But where I would look is make a list of your feedback cycles. How long are all of your feedback cycles between when you make a decision and when you know what the consequences of that decision are? So there's feedback where you try something out on just locally with a local server. There might be a feedback before that where you can get feedback from automated tests. There's maybe some kind of canary deployment, and then there's full production, and then there's measuring user behavior, which is the biggest risk in software development is how are the users going to behave. That's the that's the big one. So what are the lengths of all those feedback cycles? What defects are making it through those cycles? What would you have to do to make it so you could catch a defect one stage sooner? And what would you have to do to make the cycles that you have run 50% faster? That's what I'm always looking at when I'm, so if I sit down with the development environment, I want to say, where's the feedback coming from? I learned Haskell from Brian O'Sullivan's Haskell course. That's was one of my like 5% kind of tasks. I think I have 80%, which is kind of my day job, 15%, which is somehow related to my day job, but risky, and then 5%, which is just being an engineer and curious and trying out. So the Haskell course was one of my 5% tasks. The first thing I did was try and figure out, well, what's the feedback loop? You know, if somebody's going to code for an hour and then run some interactive tests, well, that's not that's not very good for me. What's the shorter feedback loop? Can I get tests auto running so I can save one keystroke and one piece of thinking? What's the shortest feedback? And I think I published on YouTube, there's a video of me playing around with CoffeeScript with the same kind of theme, that when you're building something, the leverage as software developers comes because you're also building the environment in which to build it. And if you can improve the second derivative, you can make an enormous improvement on how much you can accomplish. So that's the principles I'd use. What are the defects that are getting through? What are the lengths of the cycles? Can I catch defects sooner, which will oftentimes require a change of design, not just of tooling? And can I shorten the feedback loops that I have?
Okay, great. Thank you, Kent. So the next question actually is related to test-driven development, and we'll actually dive into that in just a second. But maybe for those of you who in our audience who may be not completely up to speed with the test-driven development methodology, Kent, perhaps first you could start with just kind of a very quick overview of your perspective of TDD, and then we'll dive into this question. Does that sound fair?
Sure, sure. So the normal workflow, the antique workflow for programming was that you'd write a program and then you would see if it did what you expected it to do. So you have this big chunk of, there's some development and then there's some, is this really working? Now, back when I was a young programmer and we had to dig our own silicon out of the beach ourselves, those cycles could be very, very long. It could be months or even years. Those cycles, because computing is so cheap now, we can apply CPU cycles to give us feedback sooner. But many people still divide the work up into those same two chunks in the same order. That you write some program and then you see if it behaves the way you expect it to behave, even if it's now minutes instead of hours, days, weeks, months. TDD shifts the phase of that cycle by a quarter wavelength. So you take the part of the is this program behaving the way I expect it to behave, and you move that to the beginning. So you say, before you start, you say, here's what would constitute success. Then you program, and then you run the tests. So you can see it, you can look at it as just a phase shift of the normal cycle of programming, adding logic and then verification. You take part of that verification and you move it to the beginning of the cycle so that you write down concretely what you expect the values to be. Your tests will fail because you probably referenced functions that haven't even been defined or arguments and functions that don't exist yet, so the test is going to fail. Then you program based on those concrete expectations, and then you see if that test and all the other tests that you worked on are still passing. Does that answer your question? Is that the kind of
absolutely, yeah. So the question that the audience member had was, how can I get started with TDD?
Well, you write your first test. Next.
Okay, great. So here's a few questions that I was thinking about as you were speaking.
Okay, that was a little bit snarky and short, but it's also accurate. The big difference is that you're writing a test for code that doesn't exist yet. So do that. It could be, you could use a testing framework, or you could write it as a shell script that just says, go run this program and diff the output with this expected value file, and if the diff comes clean, then return 0. But the key is, somebody tells me a problem and I used to immediately jump to, how am I going to implement that? And the switch is, instead of somebody says, oh, I need a web component that does blah, 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 I immediately think, how am I going to test that? Then write that test. And if you've done that before you've written the code, before you know the guts of that logic, then you're doing TDD. And then it's just a question of cycle time and coverage and optimizing and getting your design skills up to snuff so that you can continue doing it. But that really, just write that first test, and then you're doing TDD.
Okay, great. And do you think that it's always appropriate to use TDD?
No, absolutely not. It's a feedback loop, and it depends on where the source of problems is. So this was a shock to me when I came to Facebook. So we have hackathons at Facebook, which is usually overnight, sometimes, though it's a all day or a 2-day hack. And as part of that, people sign up to give classes. And I thought, I just got into Facebook and I was terribly nervous, imposter syndrome, anxiety, and I thought, okay, I'm going to give a class at this first hackathon on TDD, you know, and there were already 700 programmers at Facebook then. Like, I'm the Kent Beck. Of course, they want to come to the feet of the master and learn this stuff. So just above, on the sign-up sheet, just above my TDD class was a class on Tango, learning to Tango, and just below it was a class from the culinary team on how to make cookies. And when the hackathon came, the time for the hackathon came, the Tango class was full, the cookie class was full, and nobody had signed up for my TDD class. I thought, oh, what? Like, how am I going to do anything here? So that was a real shock, and I had to deliberately say, look, I'm going to forget what I know about software engineering. Because from the outward signs, it looks like this place is just a clown show. But in fact, they're delivering more value to more people. So something like those two messages don't. I could either say, okay, well, it really is a clown show and they should just learn from me, but that wasn't going to work. So I decided, no, what if I just pretend like I don't know anything about software engineering and I learn to do things at Facebook? When I did that, what I discovered was there were many, many, many feedback loops in place. Just that frequently test-driven development style tests were not a cost-effective way of gathering feedback. Like, so many problems at Facebook are unprecedented that you can't write a test first because you don't even know that the problem can exist, because nobody's ever done that with a rack switch before. Nobody's ever done that to a hard disk before. So you can't write the expectations down first. You have to rely on monitoring and reversibility and alert systems to catch the errors. So if that's true, if the errors you're seeing are truly unprecedented, then TDD doesn't make any sense at all.
Now, what if you're a startup company and you're quickly testing hypotheses and you're trying to get to market, and you know, the whole intent is to kind of find a scalable model, but not necessarily to build a permanent system. In that scenario, would you recommend TDD?
It depends. My answer is always going to be it depends, or it starts with it depends. There are cases where TDD is going to reduce latency, but there are cases where it's going to increase latency. By latency, I mean the time to deploy some feature. And innovation is learning bound, and learning is latency bound. Like, how fast can you make the learning cycles, and how much juice can you squeeze out of each one? That's a mixed metaphor, I apologize for that. But how much can you learn from each cycle, and how quickly can each cycle run? Well, the how quickly can it run is really a latency issue. So sometimes TDD is going to actually improve latency, because you would have cobbled some complicated thing together, and then it fails so miserably that you don't actually get any feedback, and then you have to go debug, and then you finally get it to where it's working well enough that you actually get feedback, and that would take longer than TDDing this complicated thing and then deploying it. So sometimes the trade-off goes like that. If it's really simple code, though, it's the other way around. Latency is going to be best served by just getting something out there. So I did 5 years ago now, just before I joined Facebook, I wanted to learn PHP. You know, I had to learn PHP. So I did a poker engine, like a online poker engine. And the initial drafts of it were pure HTML, because that gave me the shortest latency, even though I knew it wasn't scalable. I just wanted to see if I had an idea for a user interface that wasn't skeuomorphic. It didn't look like a real poker table. It looked much more abstract. So I cranked on several iterations just with raw HTML and links between pages, just so I could see if the transitions made sense when you did an action in poker. So that looked good. So now I needed a poker engine. Well, the quickest way, because I wanted to program it, the quickest way would have been just interfacing with some poker engine out there. But I wanted to actually program in PHP. So the quickest way to get that feedback was to TDD the poker engine, because there's just tons of corner cases, and you know, the straight flush beats a flush, but a flush beats a straight, and like that kind of stuff. You can mess that up, and if you mess it up, then the first time you show your game to a real poker player, they're just going to go, oh yeah, no, this is a toy, and I'm not going to spend any more time. So the lowest latency way to get that kind of feedback was then to switch into TDD mode, TDD up the poker engine, and then go back to the user interface and iterate quickly that way. So, you know, it really depends on it. In exploration mode, latency is king, but sometimes TDD will help you improve latency, and sometimes it won't. You have to figure out which of those situations you're in before you can answer that question.
Makes sense. Okay, great. Let's go to the next audience question. So the next one with 177 votes is, if you could change one thing about the current Agile practices, what would you change?
Oh, it is so tempting to give you a really smart-ass answer. So I'm not really in the Agile community. I haven't gone to a conference in 10 years. I'm not on the mailing lists. I don't participate in the discussions. I'm trying to actually be Agile, so I don't have time to talk about it so much. Seems to me, from the echoes that I hear, it seems to me that people are really caught up on practice, or are caught up in practices. Like TDD this, blah, blah, blah. Scrum this, sprints versus Kanban, blah, 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 blah. Like, and if there was one thing I could change, it would be, get to use my farm metaphor, uh-oh, I'm gonna get in trouble here. I would, so I'm not going to use metaphors because who knows what's going to happen. I would encourage people to take a step back, figure out what they're trying to accomplish, and then step back in and figure out the best way to accomplish it. Instead of saying, okay, well, we're a Kanban shop. You know, we wear the Kanban t-shirt. You know, we have the Kanban gang sign. Like, who cares? And I get that a fair amount at Facebook. Facebook, different teams tend to operate very differently. And I'll get people coming to me and saying, okay, well, you know, you wrote the XP books, tell us how our team should work. I don't know. How in the world would I know? You know much more about this context than I do. Like, figure out what your learning cycle is, shorten it by 50%. Oh, well, we couldn't do that. Yeah, okay, good. Then that's a good thing to do. So I would, if I step into a situation like that, I try and get people to remember what they're trying to accomplish instead of being so hung up on how they're going to accomplish it. It's the finger again, you know? Kanban is the finger. What's the point? The point is flexibility and avoiding overwork. It's not executing Kanban the best in the world. If you have a different way of adapting to changing circumstances and avoiding excess work, then I don't care what you call it or what color cards you print it on, or even if you have cards, or if it's done through interpretive dance, that would be just fine with me.
Thank you. So one thing I'm kind of curious about is, let's talk a little bit about documentation. So you know, in my personal life, I've as a programmer kind of always had struggles and challenges when inheriting other people's code. It's taken me a while historically to get up to speed. And to me, the way that I approach that is I would actually comment their code and reformat their code as a way to kind of get it into my brain so I could understand it. And in fact, in my first job where I worked, we'd actually look during the interview process to see if developers would comment their code. Now, not all companies use this practice, but this is what we did 15 years ago with my first job. But I've also noticed a trend recently where there's a trend to kind of have code be self-documenting and to minimize comments. So what do you think about all this? And do you think there's still a case for commenting code in a more deep way?
So I think comments is one of those fingers. If we stare at the finger and go, should I comment, should I not comment, you can't have a productive conversation because there's a trade-off involved. There's the biggest cost in most software development is opportunity cost. It's what you're not spending time doing because you're doing this thing that you've decided to do. Which is why removing waste has so much leverage, because removing waste, wherever it comes from, reduces your opportunity costs dramatically. So comments, you have a trade-off. There's how big is the audience and how much of their time are you going to save? So if I have a giant audience and I'm going to save them a whole bunch of time, the cost to the system as a whole, me and everybody else, say a JUnit, all users of JUnit, the cost of insisting that people dig through the code is going to be extremely high. So I'm over here. So if I'm in that environment, then the answer is going to be more towards commenting. But depending, you might have a so here. And writing the comments, yeah, it's a pain. It might take me twice as long to carefully comment something as it does just to program it. But the benefits are so high that I want to be over here on the comment side. Now let's take the opposite extreme where I'm writing code for some A/B test. It has a 12% chance of surviving. Nobody else is ever going to see this code. So the value, the cost of somebody having to go read the code to understand what it does is zero, essentially, because nobody's going to read this. But the cost of the opportunity cost of taking twice as long means that I can run half as many A/B tests. So in that case, it makes no sense to carefully comment the code. I'm just incurring a bunch of opportunity costs for no possible benefit. Now, everybody is someplace in the middle. They don't know exactly where they are. So that's what I do. I think, well, where am I in this? Sometimes it shifts. You build the prototype and it turns out to be really important and lots of people need to understand the details of the code. All of a sudden, the trade-off curves are completely shifted. So I need to be able to notice that change and say, how am I going to communicate? And that's the second part of where I'm talking about the finger comments is a means to an end. The end is communication. If I'm focused on communicating to my audience, I will use comments as part of a strategy to communicate. I might tell stories, I might come up with diagrams, I might invent metaphors, I might pair program with people, I might record videos, I might create the interpretive dance or the tableau to describe an architecture. There's lots of ways you can communicate, and comments are one. The other principle I use is at a tactical level. If a comment is completely redundant with what's in the code, I'm going to delete the comment because I don't want that coupling. I don't want to have to update both places. If I change one of them, I have to change the other one. So if a comment is completely redundant, then I'm going to delete it. And if a comment isn't completely redundant, if it adds information, then I want to kick the question up a level and say, how would the software need to be designed so that the comment was completely redundant?
Great, thank you, Kent. So So
Was
let's
that
talk,
too?
yeah,
Was that too long?
no, it was great actually.
Oh,
It was
okay.
fascinating actually to hear that. So, so there's some companies out there that have rules about commenting, where there's kind of like a
Yes.
style guide for their organization, and then there's other organizations that kind of give developers individual freedom to comment as they see and to be kind of agile about how they choose to comment. Which of those choices do you think sits better with you?
My ideal programming environment, or like a team environment, would be individuals making enlightened decisions about how they're going to allocate their time. Because if you and I are working on a program, and you spend hours writing comments that no one ever reads, I would like you to stop. But exactly where you are in that trade-off curve, I don't know. Like, you know so much. Even if we're pair programming, our trade-off curves are going to be a little different. So we should talk about it. And once you say, okay, well, this is just an experiment. Oh dear, this experiment really worked well. So, I'm doing it backwards. Oh dear, this experiment worked really well. This code's going to live a long time, and we're gonna pump 100 megawatts through this code per day. Then yeah, it really matters how we communicate, and we should put more effort into communication. So everybody's going to be different, and at Facebook, the Linux kernel team works very differently than the front end experimentation team, and should, because the trade-offs are completely different.
And do you think these same trade-offs apply to pair programming as well, in terms of allowing teams to make those individual choices versus a company-wide type of strategy like Pivotal, for example, has?
So Facebook historically has quite an individual culture, because back in the early days, when the site was about ready to fall down, like every minute for 5 years, somebody would come in and you'd have to say, look, I'm holding up the ceiling, and I don't have time to reach out a hand to help you because the site will go down. So, could you go over there and fix that thing? And if that person asked lots of questions or needed a lot of help, they just couldn't fit in to the environment. So we had to select for people with initiative, self-starters, and not necessarily for the ability to collaborate well. Well, culture is a long game. Culture takes 10, 20 years to change. So here it is, only 15 years later, and lo and behold, we still have quite an individual-oriented culture. In that culture, I'm not going to march in and say, okay, time out, everybody pair program, because they're just not going to listen to me. Two, they're not going to listen to anything I say after that, because it's so clearly, I'm saying it for some purpose of my own, not because it's what's best for them. So in that environment, no, I'm not going to try and impose it post hoc. I'm going to try and nudge the culture towards more collaboration. That's what I've done for 5 years and what I expect to continue doing. I'm just, okay, yeah, but could you have done this at a whiteboard instead of waiting until the code review? Yeah, okay, cool. Next time, huh? Yeah, next. Could you have done this part of this debugging? Could you have done it with 2 people or 1 machine instead of relying on IRC? Oh yeah, that would have worked better. Okay, cool. But nudge, bump, like a tugboat, not like.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot of managers at companies that have not yet embraced pair programming. They get a little bit concerned sometimes about, deadline pressures and, the idea of, if there are 2 developers sharing a keyboard, will the productivity as a team drop as a whole? And this, I think, it's especially interesting when you're talking about virtual teams, which are becoming more and more common these days. As you're a virtual worker yourself, I'm also running a virtual office. Um, have you seen pair programming be successful in virtual teams like that?
I've done it myself, so I don't know how that would generalize, because you know, I've spent certainly thousands, maybe 10,000 hours pair programming, maybe more. Anyway, but lots of time. So I feel confident in how the flow goes. And I've done, I did this experimental code editor called Prune that was entirely done with remote pairing. And so yeah, I'm comfortable doing that. Would I tell other people to do it? No, I wouldn't tell other people to do it or not to do it. I'd tell other people to experiment, to be aware of where the trade-offs really are, be aware of, mindful of their short-term, long-term trade-offs, and their human biases, because we're all, you know, we have this meat brain thing that's just wired up all wrong for what we're doing. So we're going to have to compensate for that. I think it's a reasonable concern that pair programming would be less efficient. But the instant intuition about whether it is or it isn't, I don't think is very useful. Here's my experience talking to executives. You know, you got somebody that been in the software engineer for 25 years, and you go in there and you start talking about, you know, this was, you know, when I was doing consulting stuff, and I just asked them what was the best project they were ever on, and inevitably they would tell me some story about this impossible deadline. So everybody got into one room, and you know, they worked long hours, which may or may not be affected, but this is their story. And there, you know, there weren't enough terminals, so they had to share terminals, and they just got so much done. And the customer for the software was so panicked that they were in the room all the time, and it just looks like an XP project. So to somebody like that, I just say, well, why wouldn't you want every project to have that same kind of mojo? Oh, well, because I didn't think. I mean, I thought I didn't. You can do that? Yeah. Yeah, every project can be like that. I mean, it means a bunch of changes. And I mean, you know, if you're worried about whether this is going to be more productive or not, you're going to have a hard time. If you're in there jostling elbows all the time, no, it's not going to work. But yeah, it comes down to the social interactions that made that everybody crowded into one room, that made that effective. That hasn't changed. People haven't changed in the 25 years since then. But for whatever reasons, we choose other styles of social interactions, you know, based on I would say, when I've done it, it's based on my fears. What am I afraid is going to happen? Oh, I'm afraid that I'm going to lose control of this. I'm afraid bad things will happen and I'll be blamed. I'm afraid that people are actually evil and out to get me. And then I have social interactions that look nothing like that crowd of people in a room sharing a purpose. And when I do that, I need to step back and go, hey, you know, this isn't about them. This is about me. Let me deal with my own garbage, and then come back in and see what I can do to encourage the kind of social relationships that I know produce the best results.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Ken. So let's go ahead and go to a few more audience questions here.
Sure.
245 votes for this question. Which new books do you recommend reading? And maybe another way to phrase this would be, what books have you read recently that you think you might recommend to some of our audience members? Either one of those.
Okay, so I'm about to turn 55, and my memory is not what it used to be, which is a major pain in the butt, and I don't like it very much, but I don't have an answer for that. So anyway, I'm going to struggle with remembering the names of it. There was a book about the way the information industry, boy, I hope somebody jumps in with help here. starting with telegraphs tried to kill the telephone, and then the telephone companies tried to kill the radio, and AM tried to kill FM, and like that whole cycle. The garbage we see today about copyright is not anything new. And I'm blanking on the name of this book, but that one was a real. I love that historical perspective. Like here are these congressmen voting in completely ridiculous copyright laws. Like this infinite copyright extension. It's doing nothing for creators and is doing nothing for consumers. It's just there to benefit the rent seekers that are sitting in the middle. Why is that? Oh, well, it turns out this is the same thing that's been going on for the last 100 years, 150 years. So that was a book that really I've thought about a lot since I read it. I read lots of books, and lots of things kind of don't stick much. Another book is by Field Marshal Slim, and it's called Defeat into Victory. It's the story of the Burma campaign in World War II. And if you want to understand effective leadership under pressure, I can't think of a better book. This guy, it's so many examples of delegation and deflecting praise and taking responsibility at a large scale. I mean, anyway, yeah, I found that one very inspiring for me. Martian, Ready Player One, everybody's got to read those. I especially like the story. I hope Andy Weir writes the story of how The Martian was written at some point, because that's a model to me for, as a content producer, the rules of the game have changed entirely, and I'm trying to figure that out with my new book. How do I want to what plays do I want to make to get this information into as many hands as possible? I just read Information Doesn't Want to Be Free by Cory Doctorow. And again, if you're a content producer, that's definitely something to read, because there aren't easy answers now. That's the thing. My youngest daughter is a writer and really talented, but I have no idea what to tell her. Like, how do you make a living as a writer these days? It's all different. All the rules have changed. I can't tell you. So those are some. I mean, follow me on Goodreads. I keep my my reviews up to date there. So
Great.
If you want to see what I've been doing.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I'm going to jump down to a question that I think is pretty interesting here on the list, which is, how do you see project management with Agile practices and the constant need for hour estimates for planning? And so when I saw this question, it kind of reminded me of a project that I was on a while ago, where I was building kind of a small team for a startup, and we had a deadline for creating a project, and we were using at the time Pivotal Tracker for kind of our estimates, and every developer would estimate their own number of hours for each individual task. They'd break them up as much as they could, and then the tool would tell us how much would get done in the sprint based on the number of estimated tasks and the priority of those tasks. But I had trouble mapping that to a specific deadline that we had to hit, because the tool was telling us when each feature would get done on the fly, rather than us working from the deadline backwards, which is how I kind of did things historically when I was younger as a programmer. So what do you think about that?
What was another shocker to me at Facebook is that there are, I call it estimates. Estimates are used as interventions. It's not a day-to-day thing that estimates. If a manager and an engineer disagree on how big some task is, then the engineer might do estimates and then discuss that with their manager. Like, here's the assumptions that I was making, and here's how it goes. Or if there's an external, like the F8 conference, if there's an external deadline, then Facebook deliberately sacrifices downstream productivity in order to make sure that they hit those dates. But this is another example of this, this data orientation that I have now after 5 years of Facebook. I went and checked the tasks tool, and of all the tasks, there's a field, expected completion date. And of all the tasks that have ever been filed at Facebook, many hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, 1.5% of them have the expected completion date filled in. So how can you possibly work without estimates? And I tweeted this recently. You work on the most important thing until either it ships or it's not the most important thing. And that's literally how timing happens. There's pressure to get things done sooner. Mostly it's internally generated though, because you're an engineer and you're in the middle of this gold field, and there's gold. If you're busy picking up this nugget, you want to get that done quickly because there's a bunch of other things that you want to do. It's not the Charlie Chaplin, you know, run faster and faster kind of somebody's pushing you to do this. So if you assume that people are going to follow this dictum of do the most important thing until it's not until either it ships or it's not the most important thing, then you don't need estimates anymore. Not because of some dogmatic, you know, revolution, power to the programmers, man, but just it's overhead and you have better things to do with your time.
Great, thank you. And then there's one other question here that our audience asked, which is, what's your perspective on functional programming? Do you see it over time replacing object-oriented programming? How do you see it fitting into the ecosystem?
So I've done both. I did scheme programming when I was just out of college. At about the same time I was learning Smalltalk, I was learning scheme sort of, you know, alternate months or something. So I'm familiar with both styles. As I said, I took the Haskell course, which was fantastic. Haskell is a great thing to learn to stretch your brain. I think about types differently now than I did before, even when I'm coding in JavaScript or coding in Smalltalk. My style is a combination. I have an object-oriented, stateful core of objects, and then I have immutable functional objects being referred to by those. And I don't mind stressing the garbage collector to make that work. I think that gives me the best of both worlds. The object-oriented way is a natural way to describe a lot of computations, but you know, I hate debugging aliasing errors, you know, when you have got shared references to a mutable object. So having those functional objects, you know, as far in as possible, and then there's just some boundary where you'd like, okay, here's where now everything from here down is functional and everything from here up is mutable and stateful. I think that gives it's the best of both worlds, and I don't see any reason to change that style.
Great, thank you, Kent. Well, that's all the time we have for audience questions for today. Any closing thoughts before we go offline here?
Just, yeah, it's 2 minutes worth, right? Or 1 minute worth. I think, okay, here's something I had to deliberately do at Facebook. I lost confidence in myself because I was surrounded by so many people who were so smart, who had solved problems so much bigger than anything that I'd seen. I got into the loop where I think of something and I go, oh, probably somebody thought of doing that. Well, I wonder if this optimization would work. Oh, you know, there's really smart people around here. And that's a negative feedback loop. You'll have fewer and fewer ideas if you do that. I deliberately chose to treat those ideas as precious and fragile. I'd have an idea for something and I'd figure out, well, what's the 3-minute way of figuring out whether this is a bad idea or not? Okay, that worked. What's the 10-minute way of figuring it out? so that when I had an idea, I would nurture it just a little bit. If it didn't work, I'd throw it away, no prejudice. But if it did work, I'd invest more and more time. And I would encourage everyone to try that exercise. You have this highly tuned pattern matcher in your brain. Using all of it is so much more fun, so much more better for all of us than just using some parts of it and going, probably somebody else thought of this before, never mind. So just give that a try. Give a little bit of water and a little bit of fertilizer to your ideas. See what grows out of that.
Great, thank you, Kent. It was a pleasure having you here today. Audience, if you enjoyed this conversation with myself and Kent, then please consider making a donation to our coding nonprofits, to the user interface in front of you. Kent, really want to acknowledge you for being here and spending the time with us. It was a pleasure to learn from you today.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, Ed, and thanks again for setting all this up. I think it's fantastic.
You're welcome. So Kent, one thing we're doing with some of the other speakers, I don't know if you have time for this or not, but some of the other speakers have kind of done a private hangout for a few minutes afterwards offline to take individual questions on camera from audience members that's not broadcast. Is that something that you have time for today or not?
I know I have a student actually to meet with right now. I'm happy to take questions over Twitter or at Kent Beck, or just send me an email.
Great, sounds good, Kent. So just tweet at Kent Beck with any further questions. Thanks again, Kent.
All right, thanks, Ed. Bye-bye.
Okay, talk to you soon.